Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be doing my reading recap for March. So as a reminder, or for those of you who are new to my approach to monthly recaps, I don't do wrap-ups of all of my books. I just kind of focus on either like a few books or a few themes or whatever that I've noticed from my reading for that month. For March, the very clear theme in my reading was that I did a lot of reading for the BookTube prize because we had to turn in our ballots on March 28th, I think. I tried to plan ahead for knowing like, hey, deadline for our nomination ballots is March 28th. I know I think we got like the list of books that we were assigned in January, and I was like, cool. I know the longest book on this list is Barack Obama's memoir. I know that like I'm not gonna get this from the library for like a long time. Let's get that audiobook going. Let's get the other books checked out immediately. And somehow, I don't know why I'm saying somehow, like as if it's a mystery. I know why. It's because I am compulsively drawn to doing things at the last minute. But yeah, somehow I still ended up having quite a bit to read in the last week. But I got through them all, and I am excited to kind of go through what my feelings were for the books that I was assigned. The BookTube prize is a prize that is done collectively, not just by booktubers. It's like people can sign up, but it's like heavily involved in the booktube community. And I'll link to more information down below. There's both a fiction section and a nonfiction section. I signed up for judging the nonfiction. So the first round, the octafinals wrapped up recently, and I was judging, I think it's group A of the octafinals. And I will say, like, just speaking for myself, I really enjoyed doing this first round of judging. It was really great to just kind of be forced to sit down to read all of these books, some of which like I knew about, but like didn't really have any plans to read. So yeah, it was just cool to kind of like be compelled to read all of these books and to think about them and think about like what it was that made some of them stand out to me and what made some of them less standouts to me, or stand out in a way that I was not so positive on. So for this video, I am going to be starting with the books that I liked the least, and then I will be moving up to the books that I enjoyed the most. So the first book I'm going to be talking about is The Address Book: What Street Addresses Reveal About Identity, Race, Wealth, and Power by Deirdre Mask. So in this book, Mask looks at, you know, the various ways that addresses, like the actual like naming of addresses, how we break down numbers, how we break down street names, like how these different factors impact like culture or are inspired by different aspects of culture, and yeah, how they intersect with like issues of identity and race and wealth, as the title says. She goes into a little bit of the history of addresses, which is pretty cool. I like learning more about like, you know, like how did straight addresses come to be, and then kind of also looks at just like, you know, contemporary issues and how they are shaped by addresses, or, you know, in some cases by people's lack of addresses. This is the book that I was for sure like the most excited about, in part because I hadn't heard about it and I was like, huh, this book seems so up my alley. Like, you know, you've got like this cool central thing of like addresses, and we're gonna learn about how this one like specific aspect of our life impacts so many other different parts of like what we see and what we interact with, and yeah, just like a lot of different issues. And that is a thing that I very much enjoy. It kind of makes me think now of something like The Mushroom at the End of the World, which Nicole and I talked about for Nonfiction Book Club, which was just looking at this very specific mushroom to like explore a lot of different other ideas around like supply chains and capitalism and war and everything. Like I'm just like really into like, let's take this very specific slice of like culture or life or whatever and use that to examine kind of everything that is existing on that plane through that lens. So I went into this book with a lot of excitement, and then like within a few pages, it's like this book and I we got off to a bad start. It's like, you know, like if you're like meeting someone that like you've heard about and like you're like excited to meet them, but then like you meet them and your first encounter with them is really negative and you're just immediately like, That was my experience with this book. So the way this book is set up, each chapter is titled with like some kind of city or location, and then that becomes like the segue into like a certain theme or question that's going to be explored in the chapter. And I think like that is a cool idea, and it makes sense given like the ideas going into the book, like, you know, that locations are important, that the way we describe locations are important. It gives the book itself its own sense of like kind of like a neighborhood. And so I was very excited for the fact that the first chapter was Kolkata, which is also known as Calcutta. But you know, the main thing for me is that Kolkata is the city that my family is from. It's a city that I've been to many, many times since I was a baby, because a lot of my family lives there. So I was excited for this chapter, and then like within a page was like, well, nope, not excited anymore, because there is this one sentence. I don't know if I'm directly quoting it correctly or whatever. If I'm wrong, it's gonna be wrong just by like a few words. But basically, Mask writes, Chetla is a slum. That is a sentence that may not mean anything to you right now, but let me explain. Kolkata, like many cities, has different neighborhoods, different areas. Like in New York, you might have like Upper East Side, Lower East Side, or whatever, I don't know, like all of the sides. Yeah, just, like a city. It's got different areas, and those areas have their own qualities and whatnot. And Chetla happens to be the area where my mom's family's home is, and so it's a place I've been to many a time. I've been there, like when I go to India, like that is like after my grandparents' house, like that was the house that I went to most frequently. That is the neighborhood that I went to most frequently. I'm not gonna pretend to be an expert on Kolkata, but like calling Chetla a slum is very, very weird. And the thing with Kolkata is like, there's an extent to which you can kind of be like, well, like the poverty, like it's a city with a lot of poverty and it's notorious for it, and there's a lot of ways that we can talk about that. But for me, wholesale writing off this whole neighborhood as a slum is weird. And it's a thing that would bother me like in any book, because like it's unspecific and lazy. And it's like kind of like in line with this tradition of like people not from India talking about the poverty in Kolkata in like very superficial, unspecific, lazy ways. So like it would bother me on that level to begin with. In this particular book, for what this book is trying to do, it especially bothers me because this book to me is so much about like the importance of how we talk about location and how we talk about places. And so for me, like, it's one thing to like come in sounding like a tourist about the city you're writing a whole chapter in your book about. Like, obviously you are kind of a tourist. Like, that is fine, that's fair, you're an observer. But I think it's important to be thoughtful about the ways that you're talking about the place. So for me, like coming in and just kind of talking about this whole place like it's a slum is not accurate to the location itself, and it does the arguments being framed around the location a lot of disservice, because it like completely ignores a lot of the other issues that shapes, like in this case, what the chapter is about, like who has an address and who doesn't have an address. Because that is a part of the story of Kolkata, is the fact that like it is a city with a lot of poverty, and it is a city with a lot of pride, and it is a city with a lot of people who are not living in poverty. And like India, like overall, like that is reflective of a very long, complicated, and bad story at the center of like the country's history. And for me, like especially because this was like within the first page, it set the tone for how I read the entire rest of the book. Because the entire time I was reading that Kolkata chapter, I was just reading it with the mentality of like, I don't trust the way that you've described this neighborhood because I know that it's not accurate. And so I don't trust a lot of the other things that are being described here in terms of setting the scenes for what's going on. And so if I don't trust this chapter, how am I going to trust the rest of the chapters? That carried over to some other aspects of the book. Like there's some uses of like psychology research that I really don't like. Like I like a lot of people who have like seen pop psychology articles, I think you learn to be a little bit skeptical about the ways they get like kind of converted into something in our popular discussions, like turned into like cute little patterns that don't necessarily reflect what researchers are originally saying. And I don't know if that's what's happening in this book, but because I like started this book out with so much distrust, I didn't like the way that like later parts of this book would apply things like that pop psychology. There were a few chapters of this book that I did enjoy, and they usually were chapters that did a little bit more kind of in-depth thinking about like what the connections were being drawn, especially with relation to like culture, or like there's like a really like memorable chapter about like street names named for rebels in other countries, which is like an idea that like I hadn't really ever known about and I thought was really, really interesting. And so I felt like those were potentially really interesting focal points for the book if the book had actually committed to them. But the book ended up feeling like inconsistent both in the topics being discussed and in like what the actual quality of the chapters were. So it felt almost more like reading a bunch of New Yorker articles strung together. But the product that was left for me was like ultimately pretty forgetful, except for the strength of my anger that I felt through the first chapter. So the next book is Surviving Autocracy by Masha Gessen. This book is an examination of the Trump administration and its many dalliances with autocracy, whether that's through their own policies or the ways that they were enabled through like media coverage and stuff like that. This book draws on Gessen's own experience with totalitarianism in Russia. And so that was, I think, going into the book, the aspect that I was most intrigued by. I think the book is very effective at what it sets out to do. I think it lays out its arguments very clearly. It moves very briskly. Everything about it, like, I don't think I could point to anything about the book in particular that I like specifically didn't like. The thing for me though is I think this is a book that I would have enjoyed if I had read it either 2 years ago or 2 years in the future, because just reading this right now in 2021 and like reading this early in 2021 where we're just coming off of like coup and all of this stuff, we're like, there's something about this book that felt like it could never be enough, because it just like knowing what was happening after the book was published meant that like parts of the book were irrelevant, and the parts that were relevant were the things that I had already been reading intensely about for like 4 years now. I think like the most effectively done thing and like the thing that I got the most out of reading this book was the media analysis. And again, it wasn't anything that felt particularly new. I had read some of Gesson's writing from the past few years, so like it wasn't like something where I was like, this is a new fact that I hadn't considered. But I did appreciate reassessing a lot of that stuff again, just because I think it is a thing that is like complicated and that it was helpful to kind of cycle through again. But it's also weird reading this book because it was published right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was published like before the election. So a lot of the stuff that again just felt like it was going to be the most salient to like the arguments being made in the book were stuff that the book couldn't cover. And again, like this is not at all the book's fault. And I feel like we're judging the book on these lines because like at the end of the day, like that is more about me and what I'm bringing to the book. But also it is so hard to read a book about the Trump presidency without reading it against like what I want that book to be, because like that whole subject is so emotionally charged for people. And so reading this book for me was like dipping my toes back into like these very emotional waters that like we haven't even really, gotten out of anyway. And so it's hard for me to separate that emotional component from like what the book is and kind of assess it on those terms. But with that said, I think Surviving Autocracy is a good book to read if you are looking for this particular kind of book. And I think it's a book that maybe 2 years from now, like I said, I might read it and get more out of it when there's a little bit more separation. Speaking of separation, the next book on my booktube prize list is A Promised Land by Barack Obama. So this is Obama's memoir. There's not really much more I need to tell you about it, I think. The memoir covers like some of like his early life and student life and whatever, but most of it is about his first term in office, and so like the election leading up to that as well. This was the book that I was least looking forward to, and that has nothing to do with Obama. It's just that I personally am not very interested in political memoirs. They are just not a genre of memoir that I am super like, I need to know that. So for contrast, like I love celebrity memoirs, and I think part of the experience of reading a celebrity memoir is kind of seeing the image and legacy that they're attempting to build for themselves. And that is the thing that I love about celebrity, and it is a thing that I hate about politics and politicians. And that is, I think, pretty universal across politicians. I think that's sort of part of the job requirement, and I understand it. I can't really fault them for it, but like it's just a thing that I personally don't find particularly interesting. I would much rather read an analysis of Obama's presidency than his own first-person take on his presidency. So yes, I was reluctant going into this memoir, but I actually like this is one of the ones where I'm like, I'm glad that I was kind of forced to sit down and read it, because it is one of those books where like, completely unlike Surviving Autocracy, where like it was like too soon. This was a book for me where like it was like, like now that I've had some distance from the Obama presidency and from that era, like this is actually really interesting to kind of revisit that era through his eyes. And especially the 2008 election was the first election I voted in, and like a lot of college kids, I was coming in fresh with a lot of hatred for George W. Bush, a lot of excitement for Obama. Like, there is a very different experience of politics from like my 2008 self versus my 2021 self. And so revisiting that era was really, really interesting because, especially like a lot of the things that were important to me then are different to what are most important to me now, or they're the same but in different ways. And so revisiting that era with the hindsight of like, more than a decade of, this is what his policies did, this is what his policies didn't do, and kind of understanding his perspective of like the various machinations that were impacting his choices was interesting. And so like I definitely would recommend like reading this book if you're curious about it, but also like understanding that you are reading this book from the perspective of the person who was president, right? Like, and so that means that you have to acknowledge, like, this is the person who is in power and who is articulating his perspective through his power and also his need to maintain that power. And I don't mean that as like a criticism of Obama. I think that's just like, again, the nature of politics. I will also say this book is so freaking long, and it is kind of a slog to get through at times, but the weird thing about it is, again, because it is being told by the person who had the most power at that time, there's a part of me that feels like if it's going to come from his perspective, I want this book to be as long as possible. Like, I want it to be as unedited as possible. Like, obviously there's clearly a lot of editing going into this book because there's so much ground to cover. Like, they had to apply a structure, they had to cut things out, I'm sure, like all of that stuff. But like, to the extent that I think we as the public should try to get as much information out of our politicians as possible, to me, having this memoir be super long is like one way to do that. And so that means also that like I feel like I can't judge this book entirely in terms of its quality, like, because my entire notion of quality for this kind of memoir is like so different from the quality that I expect from like any other form of nonfiction, really. Like, it's just my expectations are so different that I just don't even know how I would really want to compare it, or if I would want to compare it at all. I will also say, in terms of reading experience, I do recommend the audiobook. Obama is a great speaker, so like it's a good audiobook experience. Again, super long, but I mean, if you need something, it's a good one. So now we're getting to the books that for me, like, I loved all of these books and I had to put them in an order, but like, I loved them all. The first is World of Wonders, which is written by Amy Nizuka Matahil and illustrated by Fumi Nakamura. This is an essay collection. It's written drawing like experiences both from like the personal to the world of nature and the world of wonders around her, and she draws a lot on her experience with like living in different parts of the US, but also like having a family that's not from the US and visiting them, and like all of these different like aspects of nature that kind of describe those locations but also have parallels to her own experience as well. And she also draws on parts of nature that aren't necessarily from those places either, but I did really particularly love the drawing on nature from those locations, because it gives like a really kind of grounded feeling to like, you know, this is part of those homes and part of the experience of living there. You got like peacocks and axolotls and oranges and all these different plants and stuff, and she's drawing like comparisons or parallels or connections between those aspects of things that are like really wondrous and beautiful or fascinating to learn about to these personal parts of her experience, whether that's like growing up as a brown girl in the middle of America or like getting married, just all of these different parts of her life, both personal and natural. And this is for me just like my favorite kind of nature writing. Like this was just like such a beautiful and lovely book. As I mentioned, this book was illustrated by Fumi Nakamura, and the illustrations are gorgeous. Like, absolutely recommend getting the actual physical version of this book if you're gonna read it, because you will want to like be able to appreciate the illustrations, I think. And this is just like the kind of science writing I love to appreciate, because it's not just about the nature stuff, it's about connecting the things that you're seeing in nature to other parts of your experience, which is to me the most exciting thing about science and nature. It's the ways that like this world that we observe and describe like makes us think of our own experiences, and this is just the perfect kind of book for that. It's very reflective, very lovely, and just like, I don't know, there's something about this book that just like feels right for what you just want to feel. And so I think like if you're someone who liked like H is for Hawk because of that connection between like her story of grief and her experience with birds, like I think this is sort of kind of in that similar vein of like being both very memoir-y but also very nature-y. Yeah, I just think it's really beautiful. I know this is a book that like for a while it was like really hard to find at bookstores, I think because everyone was buying it probably, and I totally get why. Like I ended up buying it because I didn't think I was gonna get it from the library in time, and I was like, well, like it's in stock, I gotta take care of this, I gotta take advantage of the moment, and I'm really glad I bought it. I'm really glad I have it on my shelf, because it's kind of one of those books like every time I look at it I like kind of smile and I'm just like, oh, that was a really lovely experience. Next up is Just Us, An American Conversation by Claudia Rankine. This is a book told in different forms. There's poetry, there's essays, there's footnotes, there's images, there's just a lot of different things put together as a sort of like ongoing meditation / conversation about whiteness in America and the many forms of violence that come about because of racism in this country. The thing that I really, really appreciate about this book, and I think is a thing that I'm realizing I'm really like attracted to in nonfiction in general, are like these books that are able to draw on multiple different forms to tell kind of like different like aspects of a complicated and fraught story that, you know, is at times like touching on things that are like traumatic or really tough to deal with. In this case, there's data, there's references to like personal conversations, there's historical documents, there's just like, you know, general long form sets of thoughts, there are footnotes. There are so many different ways that Rankin is telling us about like how she is working her way through a lot of these different thoughts and what it is she wants to express. And I'm really drawn to that, I think, because especially for these tough topics, being limited to one form or being limited to like one set of like documentation is often, it feels very limiting. This book kind of made me think of Carmen Maria Machado's book In the Dream House and like how she draws on different forms and genres to tell like her personal experience and the multifaceted nature of the abuse that she experienced in her relationship. And I think in this case, it kind of gives this book like a sort of scrapbook feel, but like that kind of feels like it's sort of underselling what she's doing. Like it's just like very, very thought out. Like it feels, it sort of like emphasizes just like, I don't know, both the intellectual and the emotional weight going into the book. Another thing I want to shout out, I think that this book has a really good design to it. I don't know quite like how the different design elements came together, but the ways that the pages and the footnotes are laid out, the ways that footnotes are indicated, it gives a lot of space for the footnotes so that she can add in like graphs and discussions and like a lot of different elements to that. And I don't usually shout out footnotes like that, but I think this book is a really good example of like how you can do footnotes in a way that is like, I don't know, really good, just like really compelling and adds to the substance of the book. And it just also made for a good reading experience. Like I feel like footnotes are like weirdly annoying a lot of the times, and there's something about the way that the footnotes were laid out here that just like on a practical, physical level was like just very nice. Also, again, like tying into like how the book itself was being laid out and how many different things were being brought together. It just also did a really good job of making that possible. And the last book is Intimations by Zadie Smith. This is a very short collection of essays that Smith wrote at the beginning of the pandemic. And it is sort of an interesting counterpoint to my experience of reading Surviving Autocracy. So Zadie Smith is someone who I've been wanting to read, and I've heard such great things about her writing. But I was also like a little bit concerned because I was like, do I want to read like a beginning of pandemic essay collection? Like I kind of expected it to be the way that like I eventually experienced Surviving Autocracy, where I felt like I was gonna feel like it was all too soon. Like I was like, I'm not ready for this. Like I can't engage with people's pandemic feelings yet, you know? But that was not my experience at all. Like this felt a lot like World of Wonders. The subject was a little bit more like sad and frustrating and like immediately viscerally like uncomfortable in some ways because it is this collective experience that we're still going through. But I just really, really enjoyed the writing. In particular, there was some essay where she talks about suffering that just like, for me, like really hit like in a really key place that I needed at the point that I was reading it. Like I think, especially right now, like we're at this weird point where it feels like things should be changing. Like maybe we are going back to normal, but also maybe not, like because, you know, we need the vaccines distributed, and then other countries like India is going through like the worst phase of COVID right now. I don't know, like there are some ways that the anxiety now feels weirder than the anxiety from last year to me. Like last year it was this big broad anxiety of like we don't even like what, like was April last year? We were still in that phase of like we don't know what the fuck is going on. Like, do we get groceries? Do we wash our groceries? Like, we were still like at that phase in April, right? And so now this April is weird in the ways that there are all these things we know, but there is still so much uncertainty. And so there is very much a feeling to this book of it coming from a completely different phase of the pandemic. And so the idea even that we can like separate early pandemic versus the current pandemic, and we don't even know if this is late pandemic, like is a weird thing. But I don't know, I enjoyed this essay collection to the extent that you can enjoy an essay collection about the pandemic. I think I might just like be in this place where I really enjoy enjoy short essay collections. I think there's something about these writers in particular that, like, you know, they have like a beautiful way with words that just, even if they're writing about things that make you sad, like Zadie Smith or Amy Nizukuma-Tahil, like there's something like reflective being conveyed through those words that is meaningful. So I think that's part of why like 2 of my top 3 books were essay collections. And actually I think like all 3 of my books are books that you might consider essay collections. Like Just Us is, I don't know if it would be phrased as an essay collection, but it has a very essay feel to it. And I think it's just, there's just something about like essays that are able to kind of articulate particular sets of ideas like discreetly and effectively that just feel really nice. Whereas the address book is something that could feel like an essay collection, but because I didn't like the execution of most of the individual essays, it just ended up being very strongly on the opposite end of my list, I guess. So yeah, those are my BookTube Prize books that I read. If you guys have read these books, let me know. I'm excited, again, like I said, to do more BookTube Prize judging and to see what other nonfiction books I learn about this year through this experience, because it was really great to do this, even if it meant that a lot of my March was spent like just being like, Obama, I need you to talk faster. Like, oh my God, this is the first time I've ever listened to an audiobook on 2x speed, because I was just like, I get it, like Obama, like you have like 50 paragraphs of things that you need to get out there to explain the financial crisis to me, but like, oh my God, I have a finite amount of time, and I know this is my fault, this is not your fault, but like, oh my God, I need you to move faster. So yeah, one of the great things about March is that I learned to listen to audiobooks a little bit faster. So yeah. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys had a good reading month in March and also April, because we're basically at the end of April. Yeah, bye.